now we're starting the series of presentations of the papers that are included in the anniversary issue, and we do that in batches of 3 papers, starting with the papers by Jamie Winders, Johan Lindqvist, and Chang Dao. And Ellen is going to present a paper by authors who are unfortunately not able to be here. That's Frederick Gautier, Giovanni Peri, and Ilse Reisen. So she has been instructed by them on how to present their paper. After the 3 of them present, Faye Guo is going to give comments, and then we open up for questions from the audience. So we'll take our seats as Ellen speaks, and then we proceed to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. The authors have shared with me their PowerPoint slides, and I've tried to develop a presentation to reflect the slides in tandem with the paper. Please forgive my mistakes. This paper answers the following questions. How many people in the world are willing to migrate if they had an opportunity? From where to where? And what factors affect willingness to migrate and then its realization? The migration literature, well represented in the work of Jürgen Karling actually, has established the value of analytically separating migration aspirations from opportunities to migrate. The economic literature, on the other hand, has mainly focused on actual migration rates without differentiating non-migrants by whether or not they are searching for migration opportunities. This analysis extends migration studies by drawing upon additional economic theory and using a uniquely extensive data set developed by Gautier and his associates. Our 2-step process is loosely based on utility maximization and is a form of a gravity model in the first step, and then the matching of potential migrants and migration opportunities in the second. We emphasize the most interesting and selective step in the process, from potential to actual migrants. First, we analyze empirically what country-specific and bilateral factors determine the size of the pool of potential migrants. In the second step, we analyze how these potential migrants combine with factors determining migration opportunities and generate actual migration flows. Throughout the analysis, we distinguish between individuals with at least some college education, that we call college educated, and those without, sometimes called less educated or non-college educated in the paper. Their increasingly different labor market performance in most developed countries, and even more importantly, their different degrees of national and international mobility, call for separate analysis to better understand their differences. The database includes 143 countries of origin to 30 destinations and encompass the proportion of about 2/3 of the proportion of the international migration stock as conceptualized by the United Nations in 2010. For the measurement of desired migration, the authors turn to the global polls of Gallup, which are conducted with about 1,000 people in each of the source countries, selected countries. Desired migrants are measured in using the responses to the following 2 questions. Those answering yes to the question, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country, or would you prefer to continue living in this country? And then these individuals are allocated to a potential destination if they indicated a preferred country in the follow-up country question, to which country would you like to move? The measures are combine actual migration rates with desired migration rates to produce the potential migration rate. Recall that this is conducted separately for college and non-college educated individuals. Some results of this descriptive, for the initial descriptive analysis are the following, shown in the following two tables, which show the values for the emigration rates of college-educated and less educated individuals, averaging across the 143 countries of origin. In the upper part of the table, in the first row, we see the actual net migration rate, and the second row, the desired migration rate as defined earlier. In the third row, for comparison, we show the stock of, in the fourth row, the stock of immigrants. These same results are shown for the countries of destination. From this, we can observe make the following observations. There's a much larger difference in actual than potential migration rates between college and non-college individuals on average. Second, potential migration is also skill biased relative to origin country population, but less than actual migration. And third, potential migration looks very different from actual relative to the receiving country population and is much larger and more biased toward the unskilled. The authors then raise the question, is potential migration a predictor of actual? And the following graphs, correlations, show clear positive correlation, but it is stronger for the college education than for non-college. This graph shows from the point of view of the destination country, the 30 countries included in the analysis. This display indicates the same correlation, but for the 143 countries of origin from that perspective. For the less educated, the percentage of people willing to emigrate is always much larger and less correlated to the percentage of actual migrants. This is a clear sign that desiring to emigrate is far less effective in realizing emigration for non-college educated than for the college educated. Turning to the econometric analysis, the first step is to predict potential migration based upon a model that incorporates, oh dear. And here we have Mac going to PC. This is actually a brilliant equation. But let's happy faces. I haven't seen this one before, but there it is. But the model, we're predicting potential migration, that the dependent variable is potential emigration rate for each skill group. Remember, we're dividing this between educated and less educated individuals for the period 2000 to 2010. The model includes economic factors and employment rates, immigrant networks, and the degree to which social networks are related to people's indicating that they desire and they will potentially consider immigration. Policies, that is visa waiver programs and free labor movement policies, and also geographic and historical connections, language, borders, colonial times in these bilateral relationships. Let's see if we have some results. We do. And the results from this first step of modeling, that is predicting potential emigration, shows that income per person, employment probability, and the presence of networks from the same country of origin are robust and significant determinants of potential migrants. They contribute importantly to determining the size of the pool, searching for migration opportunities. The second step, and here we go, is the process of matching, given the number of potential migrants. So after we know, we've predicted the number and modeled the number of potential migrants, what then correlates or determines is related to the actual number of bilateral migration patterns. And here the model includes is first models in potential migration rate, then the growth of the GDP per person and employment rates at the location of destination. There's your gravity dimension to the modeling. Policy variables in terms of visa waiver programs and policies of free labor mobility, and then controls for geographic, cultural, and historical connections. The results are presented, of course, in a series of dense tables that you'll see in the published, certainly the published volume. But let's go right toward the summary of the quantitative effects. What's noteworthy is that while those variables affect migration rates for both non-college and college-educated individuals, the impact is much stronger and significant for the latter, for the college-educated migrants. While an increase in the potential migration rates by 1%, okay, if you look in that that second row there of results, increases in actual migration by only 0.04 percentage points for the less educated individuals, it is associated with an increase of 0.14% for college educated. Similarly, an increase in GDP per person by about 20% over the decade, equivalent to about 2% per year, increases actual migration rates by 0.0116 percentage points for college educated, but by only 0.004 percentage points for the less educated. Overall, we find that the response of college educated actual migration rates to growth rates and to potential migration rates is 3 times larger than for non-college educated. Hence, on average, a much larger share of college educated potential migrants turns into actual migrants, and favorable economic conditions at destination increase their actual migration rates much more than those of less educated individuals. The estimates reveal that destination country GDP per person and employment probabilities do not matter in determining opportunities once potential migrations are controlled for. This confirms the presumption that income levels in the destination country only affect migration through their effect on potential migrants. Our authors then go on to explore the very interesting interactions to see if those countries that have a larger potential migration have a different set of effects. And those results are actually rather interesting, with GDP being very important and to some degree policy being important. Our authors make 5 summary observations shown here and then conclude with some final reflections. First, a 2-step approach is a useful simplification. Potential migrants are affected by economics and networks at destination. Actual migrants, given the level of potential migrants, are harder to predict. Unobserved obstacles not captured by the simple policies we measured are clearly operative. Obstacles affect non-college educated much more than college educated, and we are in fact very far from potential mobility even between rich countries. Interestingly, these results are consistent with rational behavior. The income level and employment probability at destination, as well as the presence of networks of co-nationals, are crucial determinants of the pool of potential migrants. However, in turning potential migrants into actual migrants, the factors that matter most are having a college education, or some college education, and the growth prospects in the receiving country. According to these estimates, 1 out of 5 educated potential migrants becomes an actual migrant within this particular decade, while only 1 in 20 potential migrants among non-college educated finally migrated. We hope that through the use of uniquely large-scale data, additional theoretical perspectives, and new methodological frameworks, we can contribute to further strengthening the 2-step approach to the study of international migration. Thank you.
We will, as I said, proceed with the 3 presentations before having questions. So this Johan Lindqvist from Stockholm University and Chang Gao from the University of Oxford have co-authored the paper that Johan will present.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? So first, thanks to the organizers and to Ellen and the guest editors. It's really been a great experience going through this review process, and it has really allowed us to speak to an interdisciplinary audience. So thanks a lot for this. This is actually my very first migration conference, so it's a good one to start with. As Monty Python would have it, and now for something. Okay, is it on now?
Yeah.
Sorry. And now for something completely different. We're anthropologists, Biao and I, so we have a very qualitative approach. But I think in some ways these articles do speak to each other, and I look forward to the discussant helping us do that. So the article, and also this is based on, it's a comparative study of international migration from low-skilled international migration from China and Indonesia. I'm on the Indonesia side of things, Biao is on the China side of things. However, because of an interest of time, I'm going to focus mainly on the conceptual part of the paper, and then maybe leave empirical stuff for the Q&A. So the article that Chang Biao and I have written begins with a puzzling development. In many parts of Asia, international low-skilled labor migration has become both easier and more cumbersome since the late 1990s. It's easier since more people have gained legal access to overseas job opportunities, while journeys are quicker and safer. It's more cumbersome since the social process of migration has become more complicated, with the increasing involvement of non-migrant actors and growing numbers of regulations, which has often led to higher migration costs. In other words, more than ever before, labor migration is intensively mediated. We argue that concepts such as migration system, migration industry, and migrant networks, or a focus on state policies or the labor market is insufficient to help us understand these transformations. Instead, we suggest the term migration infrastructure offers insight to our puzzle and allows us to reconceptualize international migration as a process. So while infrastructure generally refers to bridges, railroads, or electricity grids, our approach is influenced by recent work in science and technology studies, in sociology, and in our own discipline of anthropology, that suggests that we should not make a clear a priori distinction between the material and the human. Infrastructures are certainly built networks, but they're also ecological and relational, and must therefore be understood in the context of human practices. Infrastructures are socio-technical systems. As Bruno Latour has put it, it's inaccurate to claim that an airplane or a pilot flies. Following this logic in the quote here, we argue that it's not migrants who migrate, but rather constellations consisting of migrants and non-migrants, of human and non-human actors. So let me illustrate our shift of perspective by juxtaposing two iconic images, which are not in the article actually. Okay, so this is an image I'm sure many of you have seen before, a group of undocumented migrants being smuggled across the border, and increasingly sophisticated forms of border control that aim to complicate this mobility. So two processes that should be considered together. Consider a second image taken during my field work on the Indonesian island of Lombok, a major sending area for migrants to Malaysia and to Saudi Arabia. The image is a series of X-rays hanging to dry against a dilapidated wall at one of the private medical clinics that handle the health certification of prospective migrants. In this case, the function of the X-ray is to reveal illness so that only healthy migrants are allowed to travel abroad. The X-ray thus becomes a specific technology that allows migrants to circulate across national borders as laborers. At the same time, however, this particular technology is embedded in a much broader context. In the clinic area itself, there's always a large group of prospective migrants and brokers waiting to create various forms of relationships with one another. Consider also the logistics involved for recruitment agencies to move prospective migrants along poor rural roads to this clinic. How medical certification forms the basis for other documents, for instance, passports and work visas, and how the process of medical certification itself follows from the demands and forms of standardization in destination countries such as Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. Furthermore, consider how men and women are treated differently in this process, beginning with a pregnancy test in the clinic to more general forms of control in the actual mobility of women, usually in the name of protection. What emerges in this description is not a smooth and homogeneous process, but one that's complex and often patchwork, but clearly illustrates how documented migration is increasingly mediated. So migration infrastructure opens up such spaces of mediation to analysis. In our use of this term, these are the systematically interlinked technologies, institutions, and actors that facilitate and condition mobility. For analytical purposes, we stipulate 5 dimensions of migration infrastructure: the commercial, the regulatory, the technological, the humanitarian, and the social. So these 5 dimensions indicate 5 distinct logics of operation rather than discrete domains. For instance, commercial infrastructure functions by interacting with regulatory, humanitarian, social, and technological infrastructures. But in each dimension, the leading actors, the driving forces, the central strategies, and rationalities, and the defining modus operandi differ. So the 5 dimensions collide with and contradict with one another, and this deep entanglement is the key to understanding what we call migration infrastructure. So in relation to the rise of documented low-skilled international migration from China and Indonesia, which are our case studies, this has led to a process of what we call infrastructural involution, in which migration infrastructure has become self-perpetuating and self-serving. The development of migration infrastructure has turned migration into an object of intensive regulation, commodification, and intervention, but has not necessarily enhanced people's migratory capability in terms of making independent decisions, exploring new paths, and cultivating transnational social relations. In other words, the volume and frequency of migration has not increased in proportion to the amount of resources and energy being absorbed in the process of migration. So this idea of involution is what is specific to the Indonesian and Chinese context that we're discussing. The intensification of mediation and migration infrastructure and infrastructural evolution can be attributed to the dual development in the broader political economy and an increasing level of mobility due to the extension of market forces and the enhancement of state regulatory capacity. So migration infrastructure is particularly evident in Asia because both developments have acquired strong momentum in the region. Governments of both migrant sending and receiving countries promote temporary labor migration. It's placed under increasingly sophisticated regulations. In receiving countries, migration infrastructure in relation to low-skilled migration confines migrants to employers, prevents settlement, and enforces return. But in Asia and the Middle East, there's a tendency to concentrate migration infrastructure on the sending side. Not only is migration infrastructure less elaborate on the receiving side, but it also increasingly relies on the sending side to achieve its goals. For instance, through health certification and pre-departure training. As I've already noted, the migration process is also often highly gendered, and particularly notable in Indonesia, where 80% of migrants are women, in contrast to the Chinese case, where the majority are men, something that we can talk about more later. And I was thinking about Pia's comment about gender here and how important it is to elaborate upon that here. So, by proposing the concept of migration infrastructure, we're not introducing a new subject of study, but are rather calling for a new way of seeing and thinking about migration. So rather than aiming to define aggregate patterns of migration as observed from afar, we delve into the internal dynamics of migration infrastructure and the practices of multiple actors in the actual process of migration in order to explain why migration has become both freer and harder. So here we have our disciplinary ethnographic perspective and bias in contrast to the previous paper, for instance. And I would be interested to talk about the pros and cons of both approaches, but that's a long discussion. Each of the 5 dimensions of migration infrastructure must be considered together. But this perspective is not meant to be comprehensive, but rather to foreground intersectionality as an operational logic of how migration is actually constituted. We're thus less concerned with the external contour of migration and migration infrastructure, identifying a beginning and an end, than with the internal workings. The primary value of the concept lies with its sharpness and not with its breadth. And this means that there are a variety of different kinds of entry points one might have when one talks about migration infrastructure. So migration infrastructure is both an analytical perspective that reconceptualizes what is already known and a methodological tool that renders visible what was previously hidden and has become increasingly prevalent, namely the process of mediation of migration. From this perspective, migration should not be imagined as a line between 2 places. If you recall the Latour quotes I had from the beginning. But rather as a multifaceted space of mediation occupied by commercial recruitment, intermediaries, large and small, formal and informal, bureaucrats, NGOs, migrants, and various material forms and technologies. These changes in the internal composition of migration require the collection of new types of data at 2 levels. First, we need to examine migration as a quotidian and processual operations. For instance, how a form is designed, handed out, filled out by whom, on whose behalf, how it travels and comes to shape migration and its relation to other dimensions of social life. Very much an ethnographic project, of course. Migration is determined neither by autonomous markets, policy logic, nor according to individual migrant agency, but is rather constituted by a multitude of activities, practices, and technologies that should and must be considered in specific contexts. Migration infrastructure provides a framework that offers analytical order to these activities without assigning them to pre-given categories. Second, we need to think relationally across the commercial, the regulatory, the social, humanitarian, and technological, and to historicize these relations, which we do in the article. Infrastructural involution is an example of how the interplay between different aspects of migration infrastructure becomes a central force in conditioning and migration flows. This explains the phenomenon that low-skilled migration in China and Indonesia become both easier and more difficult. And then there's the comparative question, of course. Migration infrastructure is potentially applicable to other regions, so it's likely to assume different configurations. Migration between Fortress Europe and African sending countries, for instance, could well be reconceptualized in terms of migration infrastructure. Could be reconceptualized not primarily in terms of the flow of migrants across the Mediterranean or the material production of the border dividing them, but more broadly through the creation of infrastructural forms that follow from the export of funding, technology, training, and expertise from Europe, often under the guise of development aid. Once we focus less on the movement of migrants and more on how they are moved by others, it becomes apparent that Europe is not passively receiving a supposedly unstoppable human tide, but is actively reconfiguring regional relations through migration infrastructure. Finally, migration infrastructure not only explains migration as a result of larger forces, but also seeks to explain broader social processes through migration as an analytical lens. Detailed examination of the internal working of migration infrastructure is meant to reveal how social changes with state-led, market-oriented Chinese reform and post-Suharto economic and political transformation in Indonesia are taking place on the ground, each following multiple logics and rationalities simultaneously. Future research that compares different configurations and dynamics of migration infrastructure refines the statistical and ethnographic measurements about the intensification of mediation and explains the uneven distribution of migration infrastructure across space and scales, may well help develop migration studies into a field where new insights on general social change emerges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johan. So, Jamie Munoz from Syracuse University has the last paper to present in this session.
Okay, so I'm going to go fast so that we have time for questions, and most importantly, we don't get to lunch late. But I first want to thank the guest editors for inviting me to be part of this special issue. This was a really fun paper to write. It let me think big and be ambitious. I do think I may have ruined part of your summers with my late papers and getting it in at 11:58 p.m. the day that it was due. So we appreciate your work. We as authors were given 3 charges: to try to advance the research frontier on international migration, offer an ambitious approach with broad appeal, and speak to a diverse readership. And my paper tries to take these to heart and argues for an expansion of the literature on new immigrant destinations, those places experiencing immigrant settlement for the first time in recallable history. The current literature on new destinations is U.S.-centric, and we need to study new destinations in a global, not national context. But let me begin where the story of new destinations themselves begins, and that's in the U.S. So since the 1990s, the geography of immigration to the U.S. has changed dramatically. Immigrants, especially Latin Americans, have settled far beyond established destinations like L.A. and New York, whereas in 1970, close to 25% of immigrants in the U.S. lived in New York, L.A., or Chicago. By 2010, that number had fallen to 13%. And across this country, schools and neighborhoods, as well as ideas about race and community, were rapidly transformed. Now, in responses to these shifts in where immigrants settle, a new theme in migration study emerged, and that is the idea of new destinations. Now, what began as a novel topic in the 2000s, and that's a very bad pun because one of the first published works on new destinations, in fact, was a novel set in Nashville, Tennessee. This literature now includes multiple books and interdisciplinary work on immigrant incorporation and assimilation, educational and economic outcomes, exposure to violence, and intergroup dynamics in new destinations. Qualitative and quantitative studies compare new destinations to one another and to traditional destinations. And the study of new destinations is now an established part of the study of immigration to the U.S. So a decade into research on new destinations, I want to argue for a new direction, and that's pushing the study of new destinations into a global context. When the frame of reference is really stretched in this way, we gain greater insight into the complicated geographies and processes of contemporary international migration. We also get a better sense of the contemporary empirical realities of international migration in the world around us. Although the study of new destinations is a U.S. phenomenon, their existence is not. So since the 1990s, Europe too has seen new spatial patterns in immigrant settlements. So across EU 15 countries, more than half the foreign-born population growth in the 2000s was concentrated in southern Europe, especially Italy, Spain, and Portugal. In Britain, more than half of all immigrants arriving in the late 2000s headed to new destinations within it. Beyond Europe, similar changes are afoot. So Israel has been described as a new destination for Chinese workers. South Africa has been identified as a new destination for black immigrants whose numbers have increased tenfold since 1990. Off the coast of Madagascar, the island state of Mauritius has become a new destination for Indian and Chinese workers, while China, itself a country of emigration, my accent makes that hard to hear, is now a country of immigration with an I for Nigerians. So as these examples show, new destinations have gone global in a way that scholarship on international migration has yet to acknowledge. So how can we best understand this global trend of new destination settlement? So to answer this question, let me do three things. First, talk about how new destinations have been defined. Second, what we know about new destinations in different geographic contexts. And third, what attention to new destinations in a global context gets us and what must change in the study of international migration to account for this wider frame of analysis. And in the process, I'd like to highlight both possibilities and some hurdles associated with this shift. So first, what is a new destination? So in the US, there have been many efforts now to distinguish new from traditional destinations in various kinds of typologies. Beyond the US, there's been almost none of this kind of work, and this fact really complicates comparative international analyses. Nonetheless, there are some common characteristics across new destinations. The first is the speed of immigrant settlement. So in new destinations, immigrant communities are often small in comparison to those in established destinations like Toronto. What is different is the speed of immigrant settlement and community development, as these figures show. Second, new destinations typically lack an institutional capacity to meet immigrant needs. So across them, stories surface of schools, law enforcement, and other institutions that were caught off guard when immigrants arrived and really struggled to meet the needs of this group. A third characteristic is the lack of established ethnic resources. So in new destination, there's really no intergenerational presence yet to transfer knowledge and social capital. And this situation creates opportunities for immigrant entrepreneurs, as has been seen in Cape Verde for Chinese immigrants, as well as vulnerability to violence in the absence of an established immigrant community. Now, because immigrant populations in new destinations are small, many new destinations also don't identify culturally or politically with an immigrant heritage. So while the U.S. itself is seen as a nation of immigrants, the American South as a region is not. Spain and Ireland have historically been seen as nations of immigration, but are now countries of immigration. Now, beyond Europe, this picture gets more complicated. So new destinations like South Africa and Mauritius have histories shaped by migration, but not by the migration streams they're currently experiencing. And this question of how the history of one immigrant group shapes the present of another in a new destination is another area that's really ripe for future work. So beyond these general characteristics, what is known about new destinations around the world? Now, as I mentioned before, the U.S. has been the site of nearly all research on new destinations, with studies of rural, urban, and suburban locales, especially in the American South. And this work has shown a number of things, including immigrant struggles to find a place in existing racial hierarchies in new destinations, as well as the challenges for immigrants of adjusting to life in new places that in many ways were not ready for them. Now, in Europe, an identifiable literature on new destinations is not yet congealed, but there's increasing recognition of their import across the region. Whereas in the U.S., new destinations are studied as communities within the nation. In Europe, they're typically defined at the scale of the nation itself, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And this scalar difference, again, creates a challenge for scholars interested in comparative study of new destinations. So how, for example, can we move between a study of the city of Charlotte, North Carolina as a U.S. new destination and the country of Ireland as a European new destination? Additionally, the context of reception in European new destinations is largely shaped by the absence of colonial ties for new immigrants. So European immigration has been deeply shaped by colonial connections, Caribbean migration to Britain, Brazilian migration to Portugal, and so on. But from the 90s on, many European countries began to see migration streams that no longer traced these colonial geographies. So in Italy, for example, most immigrants now come from China, Eastern Europe, the Philippines, and India, and these countries don't really have strong colonial links to Italy. Now, these absent colonial ties in European new destination raise a new question. How will immigrants find a place in European new destinations whose social contexts are shaped by colonial histories that don't include them, but that impact their reception? Now, their reception. Now, at present, there isn't really much research on this topic, in large part because many studies of European immigration are much more focused on political and economic outcomes than social dynamics. But there's clear room here for future work on this topic and for future comparative work with U.S. new destinations where immigrants face similar negotiations vis-a-vis histories of black-white struggles that didn't involve them but that shaped their lives. Now, beyond Europe and the U.S., knowledge about new destinations is admittedly spotty, with isolated studies across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Now, I've grouped these new destinations as being part of the developing world in this paper, and this category is admittedly problematic as it reproduces a West versus the rest mentality that offers this detailed look at the U.S. and Europe and a generalized take on everywhere else. Nonetheless, given my goal of expanding the framework for understanding new destinations and given the uneven nature of research on new destinations beyond the U.S., it's important to include them here even if research on them has yet to coalesce. And so I'm painting here with a broad brush in the hope that future work will add detail and finesse what I lay out. If you're the first, you don't have to be the best. So I'm hoping that future work will come along and really flesh this part out. So new destinations in the global south or developing world show a number of traits that really refine and complicate our understandings of the concept. So first, they illustrate how new destinations can emerge through political as much as economic shifts. So in Israel, for example, the arrival of Chinese workers resulted from geopolitical changes in the relationship between Israel and China, rather than just new economic opportunities in the former. So through China's open door policy and through movements toward peace in the Middle East in the 90s, China and Israel reestablished diplomatic relations, laying the groundwork for subsequent labor migrations. China itself became a new destination for Nigerian immigrants when they encountered tightened borders in the U.S. and Europe, so linking China's emergence as a new destination to border policies of established destinations. So if the story of new destinations in the U.S. is one of economic opportunities, new destinations in the global south help us see the place specificity of this argument by highlighting how political shifts can also shape new settlement geographies. Second, new destinations in the developing world show the distinct characteristics of global south migrations, especially the centrality of contract labor and export processing zones, two things not really present in the U.S. or Europe. And these factors create quite different contexts of immigrant reception and labor in new destinations in the global south, and these differences merit attention from scholars of new destinations elsewhere. Now, to date, no work has tried to address new destinations across national contexts, but to show how such comparative work might proceed, I want to juxtapose research on North Carolina by Helen Morrow and Northern Ireland by Ruth McCravey. Now, these two studies are quite similar. Both use interviews with immigrants and service providers in rural areas and focus on the lives of immigrants at work, at home, and in different institutions. So in North Carolina, Morrow studied Hispanic newcomers who arrived in the 90s, while in Northern Ireland, McCravey studied Polish immigrants who arrived after 2004. Both groups faced labor market segmentation and receiving communities that were ill-prepared to meet their needs. Now, McCravey writes that, quote, migrants to Northern Ireland arrived into a relatively stable society complicated by delicate community relations between two dominant groups with little history of immigration, end quote. Now, although she references civil unrest between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, her words could also describe Helen Morrow's research in rural North Carolina, a part of the U.S. with little history of immigration, but a long history of tense relations between blacks and whites. Now, McCravey found in Northern Ireland that past histories of civil unrest led to legislation guaranteeing human rights and a focus on good relations, both of which laid the groundwork for efforts to meet new immigrants' needs. In North Carolina, Morrow found a similar link between past struggles for racial equality by African Americans and current approaches to immigrants, but that this link was much less institutionalized and invisible to Hispanic newcomers. In both new destinations, then, a history of internal conflict shaped immigrant reception, but in different ways. Both authors also examine institutional responses to immigrants. So in North Carolina and Northern Ireland, individual agents played key roles in immigrant service provision by making judgment calls about work with immigrants when many institutions were ambivalent about doing so. Whereas McCravey found downward mobility for Polish migrants with underutilized skills, Morrow found upward mobility for Hispanic newcomers who approached middle-class standing through work in meat processing. Now, these similarities and differences really just scrape the surface of what the placement of new destinations in a wider context can show. In these two cases, we see the different ways that the historical context of each new destination, especially past internal tensions, shaped present responses to immigrants. We see how local institutions adjusted to immigrant needs by devolving responsibility down to individual bureaucrats. Finally, we see the different economic outcomes for immigrants in these two locales. Now, what it means to be Polish in rural Northern Ireland and Hispanic in rural North Carolina are not the same, nor are the labor market experiences or processes of racialization of these two groups. But juxtaposing studies of these new destinations gives greater insight into how experiences across new destinations compare and into what about immigrant life in them might be similar around the world. Okay, so let me conclude. First, placing new destinations in a global context makes new kinds of questions apparent. So we can start to compare how different diasporas are the same or different. So the movement of Chinese entrepreneurs to remote sites like Cape Verde, and the Latino diaspora to and within the U.S. We can start to look at how the experiences of immigrant workers across new destinations compare. So Chinese and Indian workers in the EPZs of Mauritius, Chinese workers in Israel on short-term visas, or Mexican workers on pine plantations in the American South. Now, figuring out how to assess these questions requires that we stretch and think across new destinations, across groups of immigrants, and across scales. It means familiarizing ourselves with literatures and on-the-ground realities in a wider range of places and thinking about which grouping of destinations around the world gives us the greatest analytic insight into the migration process. And this will be hard work. Second, there's the question of how much the concept of new destination itself can stretch before it encompasses everything other than global cities. So are new refugee flows instances of new destinations in formation? What about new groups of foreign workers brought to EPZs and housed in dormitories away from native-born populations? Are these places new destinations in the same way as Northern Ireland or Alabama? So these questions, too, require work on our part as we interrogate what constitutes a new destination by considering them in a wider range of places. Despite this hard work, placing new destinations in a global context remains important for the insight it provides. Simply put, a literature shaped by U.S. trends runs the risk of measuring the diverse range of places receiving immigrants for the first time against trends associated with one place. Geography matters here in a basic sense, and a literature bound by national borders is impoverished. Even if we aren't sure how far we can stretch the concept of new destinations, both spatially and theoretically, it's important that we try. To understand the true complexities of contemporary international migration, we need to push the limits of current approaches and think about new destinations as a global phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I'd like all the three speakers to sit up here at the panel, and they will provide comments.
Thank you. I just want to, before I start, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here. Also for giving me the opportunity to work with Alan and Jamie and Monica for 3 years on the journal, and it's been great 3 years, and looking forward to more contribution in the future with Doug and the team. Anyway, you can see the 3 papers presented here are quite different. They are from quite different disciplinary perspective and different methodology. And yeah, I'm trying my best to put something together for us to have a further discussion. And I'll be brief. All right. I might be I'm not maybe the best person to make comments on the 3 papers. And a number of you are here who have done research in a similar area might be in a better position. So feel free to have discussion later on. The first question first point I want to make is the notion that I'm not going to summarize because the paper was just presented. The first point I want to make is the notion that migrants, make rational choice. And decision making, is rational. They decide whether to move and where to move. So this is the approach. I think the first paper, one of the important variable that they kind of come to the notion they adopt. So that they have 2 steps. First step there's potential migrants, then the actual migration occur later on. So in a sense, there's an underlying foundation assuming migrants are rational, they made rational choice. And so I think it's time for us to think about this notion after we listen to the second paper. And in traditionally, conventionally, we think that the migrants are the main actors. They make their own decision, and so while we admit this notion is still valid in many cases, and a lot of us still adopt that notion guiding our research. So I think we should also keep in mind migration discipline and migration process have become increasingly complex and complicated in the contemporary time. And as elegantly put in the second paper by Xiangbiao and Johan, and at least one type of international migration, labor migration, and later on I will point out the other type of migration as well, has been intensively mediated. So by various agencies, by private agents and organizations and state. And sometimes the key actor of labor migration, migrants themselves, are so removed from the process. And removed from the decision-making process as well. So they do not have much information about the country of destination, let alone the job opportunity or detail about destination place. And so in our second paper, they point out the migration process could be better understood by examining migration infrastructure. Not each individual element alone, but as a whole. So I think that the orientation can provide maybe more insight into understanding of the migration process. I think it's a new approach. I think it's quite a comprehensive one as well. And so the emergence of the new immigrant destination, as in the third paper by Jamie, could be perhaps better understood by adopting somehow the migration infrastructure notion. So I remember one quote in Jamie's paper, one the migrant from, I think, to Israel, and maybe to other the region, he moved to that place with the eye closed, had no idea where to move and about that destination place. So whether that person is rational or not, I mean, we don't know. It's something we have to consider. And maybe by adopting migration infrastructure approach, we can somehow better understand why people move to that place. You know, why the formation of a new destination occurred in that particular region. And so the formation of a new immigrant destination could be partially, a result from the improved availability of information about the potential country or region, and also the previously not available. So the question we perhaps to ask ourselves is, in what way the mediating process, mediating factors, facilitate or compromise the migrants' rationality in the decision making? That's what the question we want to ask ourselves. The second notion, a second point I want to just discuss is the role of education in the migration process. Our first paper emphasized a lot on differences between college-educated and non-college educated. We take granted that education is quite important determinant in the migration process. People with different level of education may fare differently in this process. So I think that's a understandable, it's conventional way of looking at education, and education is seen as an influencing factor. And in Xiangbiao and Johan's paper, education was not a major focus, and they focus on gender instead, which is of course also valid. And but I wonder if they include education in their analysis, what would that be? Whether a better educated person could better navigate the process, the infrastructure, and to facilitate the decision making or not. So perhaps we can think of that as well in the process. So regarding education, I want to also point out another aspect of the education relating to migration, which is a migration for education, and which also is a new phenomenon of student migration, international student migration, and has become increasingly prominent in many sending countries and receiving countries. And I think also Australia, the U.S. are the beneficiary or the receiving end of this process. And the flow of international student migration to a large extent follow the pattern or direction of the international labor migration, with major receiving countries like the U.S., Europe, and Australia, and industrialized countries in Asia. And what is not clear so far, however, is whether international students will have new pattern of permanent settlement at the place of destination or not. We don't know. They might be temporary in nature. They might move back to where they came from. They might settle down. They might form the new destination as a result of their education in the place. And so also when we think about international student migration, I think we all know they are quite streamlined, so poly-industrialized in the process, as well as similar to labor migration mentioned in Xiangbiao and Johan's paper. And watch the space. I think this is a new territory of research, and we haven't touched upon that yet. But because we're talking about the importance of education in our first paper, I think also the formation of the new destination and the migration infrastructure, I think education, migration for education could be a future research area that we can explore. I think next point I want to make very briefly is the role of network in the migration process. I think our first paper used a variable of network, the presence of a family member at the place of destination, or the fellow countryman in the destination place. We take that for granted on face value as a conventional kind of indicator of network. As we see from our second paper, that is not necessarily the case in terms of labor migration. And the people migrate to a place of the country without having any member of the family previously. They utilize so-called new type of network, this infrastructure, or migration infrastructure that available to them. So we have to perhaps reconsider the notion of network, the role of a new type of network played in the migration process. So the network is no longer limited to the presence of the household member, and it could be the availability of the migration information through new technology, new platform, internet. All those could play the role that traditionally a family network play in the migration process. I think that's probably this kind of common, the points I can find from the three papers and link them together for our discussion, our future exploration. One last very quick question is, I don't know whether perhaps this notion was touched upon in the other papers, but I failed to see any discussion on changing demographics globally on the migration process. I thought the first paper would be nice if you have a variable of the degree of aging of the receiving country, for example, that structural demand of the labor that require migrants from other countries. That would be kind of valuable to consider. So changing demographics, the degree of aging might play a major role in the future of the direction and flow of international migration. I want to just throw out this. Thank you very much.
So we're running a little bit behind schedule, but we'll eat into the lunch break a little bit to allow for some questions. So there are two favors I'll ask you. First, to introduce yourself, and secondly, to be brief when you ask the question. So we'll collect a few and then give the speakers a chance to answer.
I'll stand. Please. I'm Jack Eichenbaum. Oh, okay, that's better. My name is Jack Eichenbaum. I'm an adjunct professor of geography at Hunter College. And more than 40 years ago, I was a graduate student. And at that time, thinking of the first paper, those are the kinds of papers that were being written when people first discovered that they had high-speed computers and they could do complicated social analysis. And they didn't really think out all the process part, but they produced a lot of statistics. In contrast, the second two papers really got into the study of the process of migration rather than just the form. In that process, which I began to study as a graduate student, I'm the second generation that learned how to use computers in graduate school, and we got beyond those simple statistical analyses. There were two things that I learned about migration that nobody identified per name, but I think they're still valid, so I'm going to ask you if you think so too. And one process is active migrants versus passive migrants. And most migrants are passive. And most migrants go where they act. Active migrants start something and the passive migrants go there too. It's a classic, this has been going on for about 140 years since there was reliable postal connections between distant countries. And there's a classic book called The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, which are letter connections between migrants and people who stayed at home in Poland. And you can see through those letters how people actually decided and got the money to make the move. So active versus passive migrants, and the other notion is selective migration. Selective migration is that there's a big difference between the people who migrate and the people who stay home. They're different culturally, they're different ambitiously, they're usually younger, they have a different outlook, and they're not the same. And so I just leave you with those comments and ask for your comments.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bela Hovi. I'm the Chief of Migration at the United Nations, and thank you very much for this wonderful conference. I had a specific question to Johan, actually, and I thought it was fascinating to apply the concept of involution to migration, which I think was applied by Clifford Geertz, if I remember well, in Indonesia with regard to agriculture, where he basically observed that there was so much labor being added that actually the productivity went down instead of up, and that was the involution rather than the evolution, which I think and which suggests, I think, as you did, that this mediation may not be entirely beneficial. And I think one of the the only indicator that you mentioned was volume, whether more people will be able to benefit from migration. So one question is maybe conceptually, how do you, can you say a little bit more how you see that involution process with regard to migration, and in particular, I think it would be interesting to think a little bit through how it would, is migration always good for development, or is there something like involution to be noted? But that's theoretically, I think. More practically, where we talk a lot about at the UN, and thank you very much for a previous speaker for mentioning the importance of governance of migration, is the costs of migration. And we refer to these costs as recruitment costs. You mentioned 5 different types of costs. A very practical question: do you have an idea about the proportion, if you want, of income? How high are these costs? And secondly, is there an opportunity for reducing those costs? Because we tend to think that it's better for the migrants to have their earnings at home rather than spent on mediation. At the same time, these are very important services that are being provided. So what are some of the policy recommendations, if any, that you can give with regard to these costs of mediation? How can they be reduced to the benefit of migrants and their families? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Aaron Gershwitz, and I'm with HIAS. So my question also is to Johan, in your typology of the types of infrastructures, I did not see the role of criminal infrastructures, and clearly that's a major issue, and it kind of relates to the last question regarding costs, and when there are barriers set up, then criminal networks move in to make their way around the barriers. So I was wondering, was there a reason why you did not address those, or is it part of the typology, but just like a subset of that?
Hi, my name is Juan Trivino. I'm visiting researcher from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Very interesting, the 3 presentations. I enjoyed them very much. And my question is to Jamie. I found very interesting the whole idea of the new destinations. And I was thinking about this methodological challenge that you mentioned, comparing, for example, European nation states vis-a-vis American cities. So I was thinking if you have thought of treating maybe the local level as a context of proximity, and that would help maybe in the whole process of comparison. Because, for example, right now in Spain, you can see that because of the economic crisis, immigrants, they are either going back to their home countries, those who have Spanish citizenship nowadays, or they're moving to wealthier regions. In Spain, for example, the Basque Country, which hasn't endured it hasn't been hit that badly as the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I'd like the 3 speakers to respond. Maybe you can speak in the same sequence that you did when you presented.
Actually, I thought that Faye's comments really kind of gave us an envelope in which to connect these 3 papers in a very effective way. And going to your point about active versus passive migrants, I think we can also relate that to Archbishop Tomasi's original statements about placing the process of international migration in a much longitudinal perspective to see how the dynamics evolve over time and gather momentum through social networks, through educational mobility of children as migration feeds back in terms of upward socioeconomic mobility of children, possibly through education. So I see some very interesting threads that connect actually the 3 papers but you've drawn attention to how that momentum can happen through social dynamics, family dynamics, and I would say educational and upward mobility in a very interesting way. It's very positive.
How much time do I have?
This whole process was really a race towards a deadline. So and we really pushed our authors hard to beat the deadline. So I think we can't really slack down now.
If I speak for too long, then let me know. I'll start with the discussant. Education. We have, I mean, focused on the segment of the population that is has lower education levels, of course, and both in the Chinese context and in the Indonesian context, we see that's where the state is most active in regulating. So this is really where the sort of infrastructural dimension becomes most evident. It's much more limited. I mean, of course, there are these kinds of formal routes that I've described and requirements of passing through recruitment agencies is very much focused on low-skilled migration. So I'm not going to. Certainly, education will change things, and it will be a very different kind of route that we'll be looking at, particularly when we get to the more elite level. But I won't say anything more about that. But certainly, as we see education levels rising, we will see transforming a migration system on that level. But and of course, if you look at student and migration, there's also an intense mediation going on there with brokers, and this is something that many people have written about. Francis Collins, for instance, a geographer, and the same is true of marriage migration, for instance, where there's, at least in the Asian context, a very high prevalence of brokers. The network is something. The migrant network is something that we write against, in a sense, conceptually. And there are, one of the ironies of the situation I'm describing is that migrants are actually increasingly in touch across boundaries through cell phones, for instance. But even if they have information, it's not necessarily the case that they will end up where their older brother, for instance, is, because of a whole complex system of subcontracting. So in that sense, one could say that the infrastructural perspective sort of points to another, to the weakness of the network in the contemporary situation of subcontracting. Active versus passive migrants. Yes. I mean, to me, it's this kind of. I mean, it points to a classic discussion in social theory about agency and structure, right? In a sense, what is choice and how? I mean, I would say that most migrants within the system are passive in a certain kind of sense. I would agree with you on that. Actually, in the Indonesian context, one can sort of. I would reverse. I would start with an empirical observation. In Indonesia, it is strange to travel alone. And so, if it starts with that kind of sociological observation, then of course, if it's strange to travel alone, that demands escort. So it demands a kind of brokerage that is embedded culturally in Indonesia, in a sense, which creates the kind of, I think, kind of passivity that you are pointing to. Lots of very big questions. Evolution with regard to migration is something we dwell upon in the article to a large degree. And you're very right that Clifford Geertz's inspiration, as well as Prasenjit Wara, who's written about the state involution in China. So most specifically, I would say that it is evolution is evident in the context of increasing demands for documents and from the state and the importance of brokers to actually mediate this process of documentation in relation to the migrants. So a whole space of mediation focused primarily on the documentary process is at the heart of this. And this is something, everyone says there are too many documents. And this has been slightly, in Chinese context, this has been reduced, as Biao points out. But the thing is, and this connects to the question of evolution, migration, always good for development. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Yes, I was okay. What is the process of evolution? Okay, so the migrant can't do it on his or her own. So even a broker, who drops out because he or she is a failed broker and wants to become a migrant, can't go it alone, even though he or she knows the whole process, because it's too cumbersome a process. So you have to find a broker who will deal with this in a kind of critical mass, have a critical mass of migrants. Is migration always good for development? I mean, I still think it's good. You see the money flowing in. Certainly there are remittances, but a big chunk of the money is being taken out by this system. I mean, if you're a domestic servant and you go abroad, it's about a quarter, 25% of your 2-year salary is fees. It's slightly less if you're a man, but there the problem is borrowing money to go abroad, because men pay prior to departure. I'm talking about the Indonesian context. But then borrow money at 100% interest rate. So borrowing on the local level to finance migration is a big issue, because it's a risk also to lend money, which is why there are limited systems of this kind in the Indonesian context, of course. So policy recommendations, yeah, can one facilitate borrowing money to go abroad? Can we cut out some parts of this process? It's not about information, it's about the intensification of mediation, because many of the migrants themselves know more about the migration process than the brokers, but they can't do it themselves. Criminal infrastructures, what is a criminal? I think, everyone is taking a cut. What we're looking at here is documented migration. So we have former, smugglers who become integrated into this new system. So rather than escorting people illegally across borders, you see people who are brokers who are escorting people, but also dealing with the paperwork. So the distinction between the licit and the illicit, and the legal and the illegal is very dodgy. I mean, within government, in the market, and pretty much everywhere. But there is a rise of documented migration, so people are carrying passports, and that's what I'm looking at. And there, the sort of illegality of it is downplayed, and it's increasingly legitimate.
Thank you very much. Jenny?
Okay, 45 seconds. First, thanks, Faye. Those were great comments. I'll comment on the active-passive distinction. That's a distinction that really becomes clear with distance. And when you talk about new destinations, when you see the switch from active migrants to passive migrants isn't clear. It's also not clear that initial, what sometimes get called pioneer immigrants were actively choosing that particular new destination, or actively choosing just to immigrate somewhere else.
Just an accident.
Or it was just an accident. And so, I think that question is something that we're going to need some time to think about, to see kind of longitudinally, can you see a difference? The issue of thinking about what the comparison looks like with European new destinations is bang on. I think it makes much more sense to begin to have scalar matches of a local context and a local context. The challenge is in the European literature kind of drilling down to find those studies which aren't being described as new destinations. They're sometimes called new immigration, emerging immigration, young destinations, but it's an issue of it's finding out what kinds of comparisons where gives us sort of the most leverage in understanding those dynamics. So I think it's certainly an area for future.
Thank you very much to the 3 speakers. To take the comments and to Jack, Bella, Aaron, and Juan for your questions. I think we'll now hear about how to descend for lunch, and then we'll reconvene here at 1:15. So if we manage to do that, we'll have even more time for discussion in the next session.